All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Greg Marshall. I'm a head coach and founder over at Treeline Endurance, and our blog comes in a slightly different form this month. I'm joined today by Kevin Goldberg, who's going to talk to us at length about 200-mile events, training for ultramarathons up to 200 miles in length, how to train for those, and what he's learned from his experience training for those. Kevin is a seven-time 200-mile finisher. He's got over, what is it now, Kevin? 30 plus ultras under your belt over the
Some some
course of the
something like
last
that.
decade
Yeah.
or so. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So over 30 ultra finishes, a little bit of fast packing in there as well. A 5-day effort on the 220-mile John Muir Trail. You're also the program manager at Training Peaks in their coach match program, which helps pair coaches with athletes, right? Anything to add on? Did I get it all?
I think you got it all. That's me in a nutshell.
All right, cool. Personally, Kevin and I have known each other for about 5 years now. So we met back in 2019, and in that time, I've worked with Kevin as a pacer and a crew member at a few of his bigger events, including Bigfoot, Cocodona, 250 mile, both in 2022 and 2023, as well as the very well-known Western States 100 this past June. So that's a little bit about Kevin. We're really excited to have him here today. There are a few people in the ultra marathon space who really understand the 200-mile plus ultra marathon distance, as well as Kevin. With seven finishes, there's not a lot of people who can say they finished seven of these at this point. And at one point, three in a 60-day span at one point, if I recall correctly. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for being here, Kevin.
Yeah. No, I'm stoked to chat about my favorite topic.
Awesome. So yeah, just to kind of break it down, we've got three topics for today. Major takeaways that Kevin has had over a decade in ultra running, things that we can sort of learn through your experience of running these races that'll hopefully help us if we're aspiring to run these same distances at some point in our future, but maybe aren't quite there yet. So that's our first topic. Our second topic is really a deep dive into what you've learned about training for these 200-mile events. It's a relatively new sport. There's not a ton of science out there on this yet. People are translating over from other sports, from shorter distances, and just trying to kind of extrapolate what needs to change for a 200 plus mile training cycle. So we're going to really try to go a little bit deeper into that and outline what really are the tenets, the pillars of a great 200-mile training cycle. Our third topic is a little bit more race specific to your last event, the 2023 Cocodona 250 mile. Is your second running of the event. How'd you finish the event, Kevin?
I was fifth overall, fourth male. Again, same result as 2022.
Fourth overall, or fourth male, fifth overall. It's a pretty great result to be bringing home. So congratulations on that. So we'll be talking a little bit more about Cocodona, the exact nature of what was the experience at the event, what can future prospective runners looking at running the event, what can they expect out of that experience, and any maybe specifics of training for that race. So that's really our three topics for today. So with that, just jumping into it. So Kevin, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about sort of your background in the sport. So a decade in ultra running, you don't just get out of bed one day and decide you're going to run an ultra marathon and go out and run 100 miles untrained. So what has sort of been your path into the sport, kind of into running in general, and then also into sort of these longer distances?
Yeah, so I've been running for about 12 years or so, and about a decade of that has been focused on ultra running. When I was in high school and college, I played team sports and ball sports, and as those kind of dried up towards the end of college, I started doing more like lifting and running for just cardio and fitness. Um, when I met Melanie, who is my wife, in college, she was training for the Chicago Marathon. Um, and, I would be like, well, what are you doing this weekend? And her answer would be running 18 miles. So I'd be like, all right, I'll join if that's cool. So as I started doing the training, it became clear that like I might as well sign up for the race. So I signed up for Chicago Marathon, had a blast, and was like, this is great. I love running. So I signed up for another marathon and thought I'd do it like 90 minutes faster. Um, uh, learned the hard way that going fast at the marathon is really difficult.
Right.
And then I, like I was like, all right, well, I'll qualify for Boston and work hard at that. Quickly realized that I didn't personally love running like hard and the training that would be required to accomplish those goals in the marathon. And that was around the time that I literally stumbled upon an ultra marathon. Was out hiking and like saw one taking place. Had never heard of such a thing. Went home, you know, Googled it, and I was like, this seems much more my speed. I loved hiking and being outside, and you were able to go what's perceived as slower and still, finish these epic races and less focus on speed. So I fell in love with that side of it and just kind of exponentially jumped into the next distance up and next distance up and just kept climbing the ladder. And here we are today.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. It's interesting to hear you talk about kind of the fork in the road and sort of trying out each one of those options of, do I continue to try to race for longer distances and completing longer distances, or do I make a really stark shift in the sort of training that I have to do because I'm already very comfortable with the sort of distances I'm running, and I just need to try to get faster. And you mentioned there's sort of a change in the training there, and can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on what exactly was the differences in the sort of workouts you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, to go fast in a marathon, you have to run fast. You have to do marathon specific workouts. You have to run long runs at marathon pace sometimes. You have to do, track work and very high intensity short intervals. And while I still dabble in that sort of work and do a bit of it, it's just not as much as I like doing. I have a lot more fun, playing in the mountains and going out and like, logging volume on trails, which is much more akin to the events I'm competing in now. So I think for me it was just kind of the fun factor. Like, don't get me wrong, I can finish a track workout and feel like super accomplished and like get a high from that, and I understand the draw that people feel from that. But for me, I found more joy in spending time outside in the mountains. Just focusing on moving efficiently, but keeping it mostly easy, which is obviously translates much better to ultra running than it does running a fast marathon. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I think it's
yeah,
interesting because a lot of runners probably just see running as running. And to be running on the trails and training on the trails for a road event seems like there would be a fair amount of translation. But at some point, it doesn't really translate, is what you're saying. You kind of enjoyed running in that trail environment, and it wasn't quite the sort of training that you needed in order to run faster in like a road marathon event.
yeah. I mean, to an extent, like fitness will translate, and like if you have a good engine, it will serve you well in both disciplines. But I think specificity is king. So,
Yeah.
I run with some like road marathon friends, and if I'm on the road with them, I really struggle to keep up, and if they're on the trails with me, they struggle to keep up. So there is definitely that dichotomy of like, you get good at what you train for.
Yeah. Awesome. And then tell us about, I guess, maybe that journey beyond first venturing into the ultra distances. You talk about kind of deciding to move away from the marathon into longer distances, but there's still a long ways between running a 50K and running a 200-mile race. So, what does that path look like for you?
Yeah, for sure. I started with a 50 miler back in I think 2013. Um and then 2014 I believe I ran my first 100 miler, and I wouldn't advise climbing up the ladder as quickly as I did. I did there was a lot I didn't know back then. Um and I kind of backtracked and took it a little slower from there. Um and you know, I didn't even know that 200 existed. Like I had been running ultras for probably 4 years or so. And I had no idea that like a 200-mile race was a thing. And they were being run at the time, but they were certainly less common than they are now. Um, I discovered 200s when I had hip surgeries back in 2016 and 2017. So like late 2016, early 2017. Um, was non-weight bearing for almost 4 months total, and off running for
Wow.
nearly a year. Yeah. Um, so at the time I was like, all right, I want to go back to running. Like that's why I did this. I was told that I would be able to, and I was looking for like a big like event to like benchmark my successful surgeries and to prove to myself really that like this was the right choice for me. And like I was, glad I did it. So I was looking at like Ironmans and like a couple of harder hundreds and like, things I had not really experienced before. And that's when I learned about the Bigfoot 200, which I almost immediately signed up for and then ran the following year in 2018. So about 16 to 18 months removed from hip surgery. Um,
Okay, okay.
and yeah.
And what is hip dysplasia exactly? Sort of how did you, is that something as a result of increasing running distance or
No, so I do have mild hip dysplasia, which is like what golden retrievers get commonly. It's very rare in humans. And that's not exactly what I had operated on or fixed. I still have mild hip dysplasia. Um, as a result of the dysplasia, I had bilateral FAI impingements. So basically, like in layman's term, like the head of the femur didn't fit very well into the hip socket.
got it?
So it was kind of getting jammed up in there and doing damage to the labrums, which connect the femoral head to the hip socket. So I had labrum tears that I had repaired, and they like resurfaced and reshaped my femoral head so that it would fit better in the hip socket. And I had to do something called a microfracture, which is where they basically drill small like holes in the femoral head to make it bleed, which helps with the healing process. But you're willingly breaking bones and making them more brittle. So that's where all that non-weight bearing time came from. Is once they drilled into the bone, it required significantly more time to heal.
Got it, got it. So not a hip replacement per se.
No, no. Anyone who watched the Cocodona live stream might have heard that I had double hip replacements. Which I certainly did not. These surgeries were an effort to kind of kick the can down the road, so to speak, and hopefully not need hip replacements anytime soon. It's still highly likely that I will need them, especially if I continue to run the way I do. But I mean, I follow it closely because it's something I might need, and the hip replacements, even now, 5 years later from when I got my surgeries, are like they've made huge strides. So I'm pretty optimistic that if I do need them, it'll be a pretty easy surgery and I'll be able to return to doing what I want. At least
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
keeping my fingers crossed for that.
Interesting, interesting, cool. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
tying this back into sort of the 200 distance, it sounds like it was really for you, it was about sort of, like you said, leveling that bar up, trying something that's new, hardest thing you've done, and kind of following that same sort of fork in the road that you had back at the marathon distance, where it was, I can either get faster at an existing distance, or I can sort of up the ante and see how much farther I can go. And again, you chose to go farther.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had my coach at the time for my first 200 would often say like, this is just the hardest thing you've done yet. Um, and I think that, I mean, for a lot of people in this sport, that's often true. Is like we're always looking to find our limit, and when we accomplish a goal or finish an event, like we've just pushed that limit out a little further. So then we continue exploring. Like, okay, what's next? What else can I do?
Yeah, cool. So it took until you got to the 200 distance, but you're now a repeat offender and looking to increase sort of your mark year over year. What is it about the 200-mile distance that keeps you coming back?
Yeah, I mean, I just love everything about it. It's like everything I love about ultra running is like magnified in this like niche of ultra running, which is the 200s. Um, I'd be lying if I didn't say I wasn't competitive. And I am finding the further I go, the more success I have. So part of it is that I like competing and finishing high in races, and I do better when the distance is longer and the race is more difficult. Um, and I think the reason for that is it's more of a puzzle. Like it's not just about fitness. Um, if you're running a 5K, that's 100% decided by fitness. Like, the most fit person is going to run the fastest 5K. And that's not totally true with the 200. There's just so many variables, and it's such a big multi-day puzzle um, that you really get to kind of explore, make more mistakes, and kind of trial and error your way through it. And I think that's really fun, especially when you're doing it on no sleep and just kind of like really pushing yourself to the extreme ends of your limits. And um, that's just what I love about it, the multi-day kind of life-altering experience that you get when you finish one.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. So still to kind of separate it even from maybe not necessarily just 5K and marathon distances like you said, but even comparing it to some ultra distances like the 100 mile. It sounds like really what differentiates it is sort of that multi-day aspect. Is you think that that introduces a lot of additional variables or sort of emphasizes those non-fitness specific variables much more.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest, like, obvious elephant in the room with the 200s versus 100 is with 100, you're missing one night of sleep. And most people can push through one night of sleep with minimal effect.
Right.
That's not the case with these 200s. Like, sleep is a real factor. It's a real strategy that you have to learn and work through. And it, to your point, it magnifies all the other variables. So like now all of a sudden you're making all these decisions on little to no sleep, and it just magnifies everything else about like 100 is harder and trickier to do in a 200.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And then kind of circling back a little bit, you mentioned sort of you think your build up to these longer distances might have been a little bit too quick. So it sounds like you took a little bit of a break with hip surgery, kind of leading into the 200-mile distances. But you mentioned kind of going from the 50-mile up through 100K into 100-mile distance pretty fast. What was your timeline there, and sort of what would you recommend if you would recommend something different?
Yeah, definitely. I think my first two or so years in ultra running was where I was like too much too quick. I learned pretty quickly and backed off on the throttle a little bit. And I think for the last 8 or so years, I've been doing things, more or less, but much smarter. Um, but the first 2 years, I signed up for the 50 miler. I don't really remember what my training or volume was like for that, but like, within a year of running ultras, I was signed up for my first 100. And I remember doing like my peak weeks were like 40 miles a week. And I just really wasn't very focused with the training. Um, and I didn't know what I didn't know. So I went in feeling prepared enough,
Right.
but I was worse off after that first 100 than I've been after any of my 200s. Like I needed to go to Walmart and get a cane, so that I could like get myself through the airport. Like it was rough.
Yeah.
Now I'm like going on walks the day after a 200 and like hanging out at the finish line like it's no big deal. So and
Right.
I,
Wow.
I just, I didn't, like I said, I didn't know what I didn't know at the beginning. So I was pretty much like training for marathons, but running ultras.
Interesting. Cool. Well, yeah, amazing to think that even just with training even you can run a race twice the distance and be walking around afterwards as opposed to on a cane. Just
Yeah,
the impact that
yeah.
training seems to have over months and years, I guess, in recovery
And
times.
I think that's I work with a lot of athletes who are looking to do their first 200, and the thing I stress is like it's such a multi-year journey. Like if this is something you're going to continue to do, because what I find too is a lot of athletes don't do one of these. Like I'm not alone in like getting hooked on these 200s. Most of them are repeat offenders. I think every athlete I've coached for a 200 is still working with me and has signed up for other 200s. Um, and like they see the same thing is they get better every year, like the volume year over year, the consistent base of high volume and training for these things really is much more beneficial than for I think any other distance and any other event. um
Got it.
and
Okay.
more so like other life things are also much bigger part of the training for a 200, like walking your dogs and like just like time on feet. It's, that stuff helps in other ultras too, but it's even more magnified and more beneficial at the 200-mile distance.
Yeah, cool. Got it. And that's a really nice bridge actually into I think our next section here of, really what are the components of that really successful 200-mile buildup, and what does it look like? What variety can we have in there? So kind of transitioning a little bit more into specifics from that. You know, seven 200 plus mile training buildups for you at this point, and a few other 200-mile efforts in there, even if over a couple of days. So what is sort of your general philosophy, I guess? Could you talk a little bit more about your general philosophy for 200 training, maybe what the pillars of that look like, and what variety maybe you've seen?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've worked with coaches for just about all of my 200. builds and races. And I've tried a variety of different methodologies. I think there's certainly more than one correct way to train for something like this. Um, and that's the beauty of like these long multi-distance events is like there's more than one right way to prepare. There's tons of opportunity to make mistakes and overcome those mistakes, fix those mistakes, even like during the race. Um, for me, I kind of touched on it earlier too, like volume is the biggest thing. And I think that is, it tacks on year over year. So like you're just constantly building this massive aerobic base, because you're going to be, running, hiking, moving efficiently through all sorts of terrain for, anywhere from 60 to 150 hours. Um, so your body really needs to like that needs to not feel abnormal to your body. Like it needs to like be like, all right, he's just still running. Um, so when I'm on my low end of training, it's still probably 6 to 9 hours a week. And I'm usually doing a little more intensity, during those like far out from the race kind of times a year, depending on what and where I'm racing. Um, and my peak weeks are usually around 15, at least
15
sustained
what?
peak weeks, but hours. I so the
Hours.
numbers I'm referring to are hours. Yeah. Yeah, not 15 miles. I wish. Um, but yeah, so I train by time because I live in Colorado and like the mountains dictate how far I go.
Right.
So if I'm doing
Yeah.
a neighborhood run, an hour run might get me, 7 miles. If I'm doing a trail run, an hour run might get me 4 miles. So um, I don't focus too much on mileage unless I have like specific workout goals. Um, and then from like the biggest thing is just like consistent big volume week. So like whatever that's going to look like, every athlete's going to have a different perception of what a big volume week is. But I don't take many down weeks, and when I do, they're usually a slight decrease. Maybe 10 to 20% less, or something less noticeable, like no intensity that week, or an extra rest day, but a little bit longer runs on the weekend. But it's I'm sitting between 10 to 15 hour weeks for a huge amount of time leading up to a 200. Like if the two, like for Cocodona, for example, if it's in early May, my February, March, April are pretty much at that volume.
Okay. So really 3 months, it's sort of peak volume, sustaining that peak volume for 3 months.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
coming from, like I wouldn't do that to an athlete who hadn't been doing that for years. Like that's coming from, my off-season volume is also what I'd consider, on the higher end for an off-season volume. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that you make a really good point here because this is so dramatically different from when we train for a shorter event, right? Up to like marathon, it's normal for us to peak for a week, maybe two. So to peak for 12 weeks, really at that high volume, it's a lot of additional strain on your body, and it's a very different sort of training.
yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it goes back to like what I love about it is like, yeah, I'm doing some intensity in there. Whether it's like a hard trail effort or a focused effort on the treadmill, but like when my volume's that high, like the intensity does go down. Like, if we're talking percentages, like, maybe in the off season I'm doing like 80/20, where it's like 80% easy, 20% hard. And like when the volume's higher, it's probably more like, 95/5, as far as the percentage breakdown between like what is easy aerobic miles versus, higher intensity strain miles.
yeah, interesting. So can you talk us actually through a little bit, maybe more? If is there a right way to progress that intensity? Is there one right way, or are there a variety of ways in which sort of you dovetail? And when we refer to intensity here, we really mean, just to clarify, like anything more than zone two or sort of that easy conversational aerobic effort, right, Kevin? So anything like tempo, VO2 max, hill repeats, anything in that category.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, I do think there's more than one right way. I mean, I've done everything from, I worked with CTS, I worked with Uphill Athlete, anyone who might know those two organizations, or maybe not, that they have very different, ideologies. So I've done reverse periodization, more intensity during low volume times, and that's pretty much where I sit most of the time. That's my preferred method of training. Um, where, I will start like, again, using Cocodona as an example. If we are in, December, January, I'm probably doing some high intensity VO2 style efforts, shifting into threshold efforts as we get into February, March, and then like March, April is tempo, steady state, more longer, more sustained intensity, but not quite as intense, and upping volume along the way. So as intensity goes down, volume goes up. Um, that's probably my personal preferred way. But on the other side, like I've done a build with Uphill Athlete where we did almost no intensity, just build like the biggest aerobic base we can. Um, and I had success with that too. I mean, these events, you're on your feet for so long. So if you can keep moving efficiently, even if that's an 18-minute mile, like you're going to find success. It's much more of a durability contest than it is an aerobic contest in my experience.
Interesting. Okay. So big possible variety in training. We just want to keep the stress high, I guess, regardless of whether that's some intensity volume or no intensity volume or a really low amount of intensity volume. And you also talked about sort of reverse periodization, sort of what that means, like basically doing intensity early in a training block and then fading that away in favor of the more race specific training, which is that volume that you're talking about as you get into those latter weeks, right? Whereas for a shorter distance, sort of what we consider that traditional periodization, we're looking at doing higher intensity stuff closer to the event to try to run faster in that event, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the closer you are to the event, the more specific you want to get. So, when you're getting closer, the intensity drops, you're doing more hiking, more course specific work.
So what do you say to the fact that you are sort of peaking around that 15 hours a week for your sort of your high end training volumes, but that's kind of a tenth, it's of what you're saying the race could be for athletes come race day, anywhere from 60 to 150 hours for the actual event. How does that translate? How do you bridge that gap, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where like anyone who's done 15 hours a week, like sure, there's people who do way more. Most Ironmen train more than that, and their events only last if they're fast, their events are lasting, 10 hours or less. Um, I think for you have to also balance sleep recovery. Like you need to be able to handle this volume. And if you're doing 15 hours every week for 12 weeks, I think that's where the benefit towards these 200s comes from is it just sets the normal baseline for your body and like how much you're spending moving at this like pretty high level for a single sport athlete, who's just spending time on their feet. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so I think it's just consistency over time. And I mean, I do bigger weeks than 15 hours. Like I'll do, like I'll pencil in like training races or like fast packing with friends, and like some of those
yeah.
I've reached 30 hours a few times. Um, but I find that the recovery from weeks like that throws more of a wrench into training than the benefit. Because then you need to take a down week. Whereas if I
Right.
can just rattle off, 12 to 15 hour weeks like clockwork, I think that's more beneficial for these styles of races because, your body doesn't quite like say like, all right, the week's ended, like let's start again. Like it doesn't really know the difference between that sort of thing. So it's just your everyday. Like if you're averaging 2 hours a day, then that's what it knows. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. And yeah, we're already talking about huge volumes here, right? At 15 hours a week, because you've got to factor in, most of us are working a full-time job, so that's 40 hours a week. And then you've got just training alone gets you to 55, but you probably need half of that devoted to recovery, a little bit of extra sleep, some stretching, massage, things like that. So really you're looking at 15 hours of training can be what, 20 to 25 really hours of commitment to your sport out of the week.
definitely. And I mean, that's not to, like, I don't record or really mention the fact that I walk an hour a day. And I stress that my athletes should try to get as much walking in as they can because even the top ends of these 200s spend a good amount of time walking. And it's just different, you're engaging different muscles. The whole like lower leg activation is different from a hike to a run. So if you're not doing a lot of hiking and walking in your training, it's going to be a rude awakening when you run one of these. Um, so, that's 7 hours of walking a week. in addition to 15 hours of training. So yeah, it probably is upwards of 20 to 25 when you look at the total package of like the time you're investing, you know, into the training each week.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. So really takeaway there, it sounds like, is it's not something that we do in 1 or 2 peak weeks. It's a fitness that we have to build over months and years to be prepared for an event like a 200, because we can't get any close to that race volume of training in a standard work week when we have our other priorities. It's simply too much time to even fit in, even if we had the energy to do so.
Exactly. And I think there's more harm than good that can come from that. And, you know, while I do think like multi-year training for these events like serves people well, I do think that they really can be done by anyone and they're more approachable than people think. Like, I think most people build these events up to be a lot scarier than they really are. Like, when someone comes to me and they want to run their first 200, like I say like, hey, I'd love 6 months to get you there. And that assumes they're like running regularly, whether that's like 25 miles a week or whatever, but it assumes they're relatively fit and running regularly. Like we can get you there in 6 months. These races generally have pretty good cutoffs and are, you know, able to be accomplished by anyone who has the willpower and desire to do so. Um, so, you know, when I say that, I'm speaking more towards like how can someone perform their best at one of these events, but like that's not to say that they're not like approachable and doable by anyone. I think if you want to do one of these, you don't need to like it doesn't need to be a multi-year process. It should be respected and you should train properly, but it doesn't need to be a multi-year uh, journey to the start line.
Interesting, interesting. So it sounds like sort of at the shorter end of that would be a 6-month training build. And is that assuming you've already run 50, 100-mile races before, or are you willing to work with an athlete who is coming to you and saying, I want to run a 206 mile 6 months from now, and I've run, a marathon, or maybe I've run my first trail 50K.
Yeah. You know, the more experience you come in with, the better. I think there's no way around that. That's not to say I wouldn't entertain, you know, someone in the latter example where they maybe don't have that experience. Um, and I actually did have an athlete run Cocodona this year who had very little experience going in. I think you know, I've said it a couple of times already, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And I think the less experienced you are, the more true that is. And there are other factors beyond the physical that can really um, mess up a race in something like a 200 plus mile adventure. And I think the more experience you have with ultras, the more we can mitigate that. So I wouldn't rule it out. I think again, anyone can come and be successful here. You really have to want it because there's time to make mistakes and fix those mistakes and push through. Um, but there's no way around, you know, experience is better.
Yeah, interesting. So a nice little, you could do it maybe, right? Like it's not out of the
I
question.
mean,
Don't rule it out just because you've only run a
yeah,
marathon before.
totally. I mean, I think you can do it definitely. It's just like how bad do you
Yeah,
want it and how hard are you willing to work and like are you willing to fail? Like sign up, try this year and you know, if it doesn't work out, then hey, now you've trained a cycle and you get to have another whole year to try it again. Like,
yeah, yeah.
and you'll be back and like so like not even like more than double prepared because like these things kind of stack.
Yeah, yeah, you got the training and also at least you have the experience, even if it doesn't work out, you have the experience of going out and finally getting to try a race like this.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Cool, cool. Okay. And then we talked a little bit already about sort of intensity, and sort of just like that whole grouping of zone 3, 4, and 5. Do you have a preference within that type of work or something, sort of a way you would stagger those sorts of intensity if you were working with an athlete to build out a training block for a 200, or is it all sort of the same thing if you're training for a 200?
I mean, again, there's more than one correct way. You know, most of my athletes will do reverse periodization to an extent. So they're going to be doing that zone five harder work further out away from the event, and then kind of moving to lower intensity work as volume increases as they get closer to their goal race. Ultimately, cutting down on intensity almost altogether as we get really close and just focusing on hiking and logging trail miles.
Got it. So starting somewhere in the neighborhood of like more zone 5 hill sprints, and then maybe progressing that intensity volume part of your week down into like tempo effort, steady state effort, marathon pace sort of runs. as you get deeper into that training block before maybe even cutting it all completely in favor of zone two volume in the last few weeks or a couple of months before the race.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for example, it's June 14th today, 2023, so we're about a month out from the Tahoe 200. I have four athletes running Tahoe. They're all doing steady state tempo work now, will be for the next few weeks, and then we'll do a couple of weeks just before taper, of probably little to no intensity, maybe some fartleks or some like short things just to keep them honest. And while increasing volume and logging, a lot of hiking, and then taper and game day.
Cool. Got it. What about strength? Strength sort of a different thing, even higher intensity than what we consider high intensity work. Do your athletes lift
Yeah,
weights? Do you?
I don't as much as I'd like to. It's certainly the first thing for me that falls off personally, like when life gets in the way. And that's just mostly because I don't like doing it. Like I love running and don't like lifting weights and doing strength. So it's
It
the first
sounds
thing that
like
falls to the
many
wayside.
runners can probably
Yeah, yeah, I'm
relate to
sure.
that one.
I think it really depends on the athlete. Like, do they come from a strength background? Do they like it? Do they live in a place where they maybe can't get course specific work and a lot of vertical gain in? Um, it's important to remember that stress is stress. So, like, if we're adding in strength, we need to take volume away somewhere or make considerations for the added stress that the strength is going to bring in. I think most athletes should be doing something, strength related and something other than running to kind of um, stave off injuries and work towards work on their weaknesses that might be course specific. Like if you're an athlete living in Iowa, um, and you don't have a lot of trails or vertical gain to get to, then strength is probably going to be a more important component of your training. Whereas if you're here in Boulder and you're getting the trails, during the week and on the weekends, and you're doing a ton of climbing, that's going to mimic a lot of those strength benefits that we see. Um, so it really is athlete to athlete for me. And I think, it depends on the preferences and the history of the athlete as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're articulating sounds to me like it's sort of the same as with pretty much any endurance sport, right? Is that if we're doing strength work, strength is sort of inherently the least specific to an endurance sport. It's sort of the opposite of an endurance sport. So if we're trying to train for performance in an endurance effort and we're compromising the amount of endurance training we can do because we're doing that strength work, it's really hard to find that balance, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is, and I think a lot of runners are still searching for that. I mean, I could go do a bunch of like mountain stepping type movements, lunges and squats, and be totally wrecked the next day. Like seriously, I'd like be limping, but I could go run a 100 miler tomorrow and be fine. Um,
Right, right.
so it's like you said, it's the least specific thing when it comes to endurance sports, but I think there is a place for it for a lot of athletes.
Yeah, and it sounds like exactly how much that place is athlete dependent, is background dependent, and is also event specific.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, interesting. So if you have a particularly vertical race, strength probably has a larger part in that than
It's,
really flat
yeah,
track race.
yeah. Especially if you don't have access to like course specific trails to run on and do workouts on and that sort of thing.
Yeah, interesting. So strength can sort of substitute for maybe some uphill specific workouts if you don't have access to those mountains as well.
Yeah, yeah, or certainly stave off the negative effects of not being able to access those things. I mean, I do try to get my athletes to get to trails and like even, a little specificity goes a long way. So if they can do like even like a training camp on something that's somewhat course specific, I think it's almost more beneficial than doing a cycle of strength training.
Got it. Got it. Cool. So we've talked about sort of, the pillars of training for a 200, the place for intensity in that, the strength in that. What about the mental side? Do you have any, additional sort of, I guess, recommendations about preparing for the mental strain outside of the physical?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty low hanging fruit for a lot of people, especially people who are going into 200s. Like so much of performance at these races can be willed into existence because, you look at, what is considered a winning time or a fast time, like the paces are anyone can run a 15-minute mile at most given times, unless it's really, really steep terrain. Um, so most of these, success in these races is how bad do you want it and how willing are you to suffer and how deep are you willing to go. And that takes a lot of work to get to a place where when you're sleep deprived and really sore and really, hurting to push through those barriers. So, um, I work with my athletes to, everyone's going to go through similar trials and tribulations during these races. No one's going to get through unscathed. So rather than, spend time visualizing a perfect race and hoping for a perfect race, anticipate that shit is going to hit the fan. And, worry not about what is going to go wrong, worry how you're going to react when when something goes wrong. Maybe your knee's gonna hurt. Maybe you'll sprain your ankle. Maybe you'll lose your stomach. Chances are something like that will happen, but something like that's gonna happen to everyone. And, it oftentimes seems like, well, I'm the only one with this problem. If this wasn't happening, I could go faster. If this wasn't happening, I'd be in this place. But like
Right.
your competition, every other fellow athlete out there is going through a similar experience, and they have their knee or their ankle or their stomach. Um, so I spend a lot of time focusing on how I'm going to react to whatever my trial is going to be during the race, trial or more often trials, plural. Um,
Yeah.
and I try to have my athletes do the same. Like, how will you react? How will you move through it? Because it's going to happen. So just be prepared for that. Um, yeah, I mean, there's so many mantras that you could go through, like, but at the end of the day, like these things are really, really hard. So I think wrapping your head around that and embracing it, is the key to success.
Got it. Yeah. And I think, it's interesting that you point out about the mental side of it is, these are things that you just can't train and in your day-to-day training. It's maybe one of the reasons to go out and run those other distances and sort of a build to a 200 or run a couple at those distances before moving on, is because those races will be kind of a unique opportunity, because we don't want to be going out and training and getting to that place of discomfort where we're worried that we've got an injury and we just have to face kind of how we're going to get through it, because we're going to have to take so much recovery time afterwards. We're going to end up losing any benefit of sort of dealing with that. It's just not something we want to do during the training block.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Cool. Okay. Any pitfalls, I guess, sort of wrapping up on the sort of training for a 200 plus race, things you've seen people do before that you think you'd really advise against?
One of the biggest questions I get from athletes is like, what about sleep? Like not only like how much should I sleep or what should my sleep strategy be, but like also should I train to run like sleep deprived and like train to run at night? So kind of in two parts there. Like I think the best strategy, and it's so personal. It's like asking what kind of shoes I should wear. Like, everyone's different. Everyone has different tendencies of like how much sleep they need and how they operate on minimal sleep. Um, I've found that the best strategy is to, it sounds like so simple, it's silly, but like sleep when you're tired, don't when you're not. And that's kind of, to say like don't have like a set plan, because if you get to an aid station where like you're like I'm going to sleep here and you're not tired, then you're just wasting time. You're probably sitting there and unable to sleep. Like, you know,
Maybe even
sleep when you're
stiffening you
tired.
up.
Don't. Yeah, like I mean that's inevitable, but like yeah, I think just stay flexible. Be open to sleep when you need it, but don't force it. And then sleep and training, like I think sleep is the most important thing in training for recovery. I think there's far more to lose than to gain than doing night running or any sort of like training that's going to cause you to mess with your sleep cycle or lose sleep. Um, the best way to learn what that feels like is to do these events, run 100 milers, run 200s. I do not advise doing any sort of sleep deprivation or overnight running in training. I think you gain far more recovery benefits from healthy sleep habits than you get from the experience of training through sleep.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so avoid the all night runs, folks.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other sort of concluding thoughts, things people should know when training for a 200 plus mile effort before we sort of transition?
I mean, obviously, it's a luxury to have a coach, but I'm very biased. But I think anyone who's training for one of these, I mean, they're very expensive races. This is an expensive sport, and if you're going to make the investment, I think if you have the ability to do so, go all in and get yourself a coach. I mean, I love having a coach myself. The accountability, someone to bounce ideas off of. For a 200, it's so much more than just the training. It's the logistics of the race. It's the strategy of the race. It's the recovery, the prep beforehand, the kind of come down afterwards. I think there's a lot more a coach can do for you for this sort of distance and event than they can for other ultras. So, I mean, I love having a coach myself and would recommend that if you are financially able to do so, hire a coach for your 200s.
Yeah, somebody who has maybe already seen athletes go through some of the things that you're likely to experience in something like a 200-mile race, is particularly if you haven't run anything close to that distance before. Like if you're coming from a marathon or a 50K and you know there's a lot you don't know about training for the specific demands of the event, having another person there who's seen athletes go through it before, potentially
Yep.
a big asset for you in that block. Cool.
Yep.
Um, awesome. So, sort of with that, let's maybe transition to your latest project, the Cocodona 250-mile endurance run. It happened. How long has it been now, Kevin? 45 days or so since the gun went off.
I think 45 days since the gun went off. Yeah, I've been done for about almost 6 weeks.
Yeah, cool. So tell us a little bit about this race. There's been a lot of chatter, particularly in the ultra running community, about this. It's a fairly new race, right?
Yeah, so it's been 3 years running now. It's put on by Viper Running. I don't know the detailed history of the race, but I know Jamil of Viper Running has had a vision to kind of link up a bunch of historic mining towns in Arizona and create like a European style like race that goes like off the grid into the desert, mountains, and then like pops into a town and then back off the grid and then back into a town. Um, so he's been working on that route for a long time, and they had the inaugural race in 2021. Yeah, 2021. Um, and it was coming out of COVID, so it was like a wait list, and they weren't sure it was going to even happen. And then um, it happened, and everyone got invites to register. Despite some peer pressure, I was able to turn that inaugural year down. I was out there to crew and pace. I ended up pacing like 80 miles of the course. And I decided like at the event that I was going to do it the following year. It was just super fun, super
Couldn't help it.
rugged, really cool. Yeah, it was just really like I'd run at that point 5 200s, and I had done all the destination trail events, which are spectacular races in their own right. But something about this was just special, linking up all those towns, and it felt like a true point to point journey. From Black Canyon City, just north of Phoenix, to downtown Flagstaff. So I knew I had to do it, and that's what I did in 2022, and then came back again for this year.
Cool, cool. Um, so I guess tell us a little bit about maybe, what to expect out of this race. First of all, like it's not your average 200. It's another 50 miles beyond the 200-mile length. So do you believe if athletes maybe even have run the 200-mile distance before, is that a significant jump from 2 to 250?
It is, yeah. You can't fake 50 miles. And if you don't believe that, then call me when you're running Cocodona and you're at mile 200, and we'll talk. Um, because it feels like there's a long way to go when you're like 15 miles or 10 miles outside of Fort Tuttle and you still have 50 miles to go.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it's the hardest 200 in this country, and I think largely in part to the additional, like the additional 50 miles is a huge part of why it is. I think mile for mile, like the Bigfoot 200 course is probably more difficult, but Bigfoot is over in 209. So, um, yeah, I think Cocodona takes the crown for the hardest in the US.
interesting. And outside of it just being longer, what else sort of defines the experience of being out here? Like where are you going with it? What are these towns like? What can we expect out of the experience of being there and being in that race?
Yeah, I think that's what's cool too, is you can kind of expect everything. Like you get all sorts of different weather from heat to extreme cold. The course is really rocky and rugged for a lot of it, but then there's also like beautiful, like perfect best single track you've ever run on through like Sedona and Flagstaff. And the towns are really cool because they're like historic mining towns, and a lot of them are now like tourist and trail towns. So there's people who are curious about the race, people who are out there to support you. Um, and it's a really welcomed like reprieve when you like come in from the mountains or the desert and run through a town, even though generally the town sections are relatively short and then you're back out on the trails. Um, but it really does feel like you're linking together something epic when you're out there and checking off section by section. So yeah, there's just it's a really cool journey.
Cool, cool. And then now Aravaipa has expanded this event as of 2023 to include the 250, but also now what is it? It's a 125-mile Sedona Canyons, they're calling it, and the Eldon Crest, is it 36 miles?
Yeah, it's 36, but anyone who ran Eldon Crest will tell you it's more like 39. Um, they,
Closer to
they might
40.
they might as well just call it the Eldon Crest 40.
Yeah. Okay. So, how does this maybe change, if anything? It looks like, the event's growing still. It's only a couple of years old, and they're adding race distances to it. Did you see any of those other races out there? Did that contribute to your experience at all?
It didn't contribute much to my experience. I was passed by one person, Jeff Browning, running the 125, and I wish I was awake for it because I would have tried to run with him. He only finished like 30 minutes ahead of me. Um, but perhaps I'll
Taking one
touch
of
on
those
that
dirt
story.
naps?
I was taking a 7 minute nap, which really was needed, so that was good. But yeah, it didn't really affect my race much. From what I heard from others, it only really enhanced um, most people's races. I know there was concern about like parking and stuff at aid stations and just kind of more
Right.
clusters later on in the race. But from what I heard, everything went off pretty smoothly, and it was a real addition to the experience. And like now it's not just a 250. It's a week long like running festival where you have these other events that might be more accessible to people who aren't quite ready to take the jump to 250. So I think it's awesome. It really was cool, and it was cool to see like the 36ers and the 125ers finishing alongside the 250ers when I went back down to the finish line, like Friday and Saturday.
Cool. Cool. So this is your second year. You've run a couple of the 200s a couple of times, but what brought you back to Cocodona for 2023 after what you said was already a great result in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the hardest one, and like, like for a good part of the race, I'm suffering and miserable, but like, it's just so fun. Like
You
the
make
way
it
they have
sound
the live
fun.
stream set up, yeah, the way they have the live stream set up, the way like people are cheering you on the whole time, the way like they have the finish line in downtown Flagstaff, and it's just like around the clock party as people are finishing. I don't know. It's just I really like Arizona. I think it's a beautiful state, and the traversing of it that this race allows us to do is something special. So I'll almost certainly be back for 2024. I'm not signed up yet, but I plan to be there. Um, so yeah, it's just keeps calling me back.
Awesome. Well, maybe some people from here will see you out there. So, if you're comfortable with it, can you kind of walk us through a little bit of, what was your game plan going into the race this year and what actually happened? What was your experience actually being out there at your particular race this year? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I went into this race having finished, in fourth male and fifth overall last year. I went into this race with really high hopes of being on the podium, and even like a long shot at like winning the race and setting or setting a course record, finishing in 72 hours or less. Um, I think that was possible for me this year. Like I had that fitness, I had that experience. Um, and I came just short of it. Which I'm really happy with the race and how it unfolded for me. I think it was my strongest 200-mile performance yet, and that's part of the reason I want to go back to is I want to keep improving, and I do think I can be on that podium. Um, but this race
So
was,
a very competitive sort of approach kind of coming into this year.
Yeah, more competitive
Yeah.
than I've ever been before. Like the first time I've had like true performance goals. Um, and I think that really messed with my head. Like I slept 2 hours the night before the race, which just made for a rocky start. I was
Mm,
like just kind of foggy and sluggish, and like my head was not in the game for the first couple of days of the race. Like all that fire and like desire of like wanting to be competitive, like just kind of faded away almost as soon as the race started. Um, I slogged up to uh, Crown King, and I was like actually an hour ahead of like what I planned to be. So moving really well, but just again, like head was not in the game. I was really surprised at like how many people were ahead of me. Um, and that was kind of the theme, like moving through the first 100 miles. Like I just couldn't believe how many people were up there with me. Like I'm used to being in the top 10 by that point, and I don't think I was until mile like 120 or so. Um, and I was trying not to pay too much attention to it because I was just kind of getting in my head about it. So it was a bit of a slog with the
yeah.
sleep. I tried sleeping. I did sleep a little night one. I never sleep night one. But when you miss the night of sleep before, it was kind of essential. Um,
That
and
first
then,
50K is supposed to be brutal, isn't it? What are the stats on it?
yeah, the first 30 miles has over 10,000 feet of gain.
Yeah,
Um,
so
and
really competitive with the country's most sort of rugged 50K races, and at the start of a
yeah, I mean,
200.
yeah, I think, that statement is true, but it's almost like saying like, oh, I climbed Everest, like, because like, like Everest is not 29,000 feet. I don't know the numbers, but you're not starting Everest
Right.
from sea level. I think what a lot of people realize is most don't realize is most 50K races, like that number includes up and down because you usually end in the same spot. Um, like this would be a point to point 50K. So it is a little more spread out, that gain, if that makes
Got it.
sense. And that's not to say it's
Yeah,
not like, I mean, it's a monster day one. Don't get me wrong.
right.
Like it's really hard. Um, but I wouldn't put it up there against like Speed Goat and the Ride because like you're essentially for those doing like 10,000 feet in 15 miles. You know what I mean?
Right, because you've got to come back down
Um,
all of that distance, and that's in some ways even more damaging to the muscles in your legs.
yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'd rather have that spread out on a lesser grade for double the mileage. But again, like now I feel like I'm doing too much disservice and not say like it's really, really hard.
It's still
Um,
very hard, right?
yeah, it's a beast of a day one. I think there is like 4,000 feet of downhill in that first 30 miles too. So there's not
Right.
like there is some down. It's somewhat undulating.
And
Yeah,
unsupported,
so it's
really, it sounds like.
Yeah, this year they had a water drop in two locations. There's an aid station at mile 8 and mile 30 before you get to Crown King, which is mile 37. Um, so there's almost with the exception of the water drop, there is a like a 22-mile section without aid. Um,
Yeah,
and luckily
right.
in
Yeah.
2023 there was a lot of water on the course, so we were able to filter. Um, but it's a long time to go without seeing aid. And you leave Crown King. I think I left Crown King around like 2:30 p.m. Um, and like you at that point you're heading to the like I got to the next aid station after that, just after or just before sunset, before heading into night one. Um, and yeah, from there, like all I wanted to do was sleep night one. Um, so I think I got like 20 minutes, maybe not even at Whiskey Row, which is mile 80. And then you and I left Whiskey Row. You paced me from Whiskey Row to was it Iron King, I think,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
which is about a half marathon. I think that was my fastest leg of the race. We did like a 13-minute average. Um,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
pretty
11,
chill section.
11 minutes. Yep, for the last
Yeah,
10K or so. Yep.
yeah. That's a fun section. And then, yeah, that's kind of like I feel like Whiskey Row is like the end of the first third of the race or so, and then like the middle section is going through like Fain Ranch, the kind of flatter sections leading up to Mingus Mountain. Then you go up and over Mingus, down into Jerome, Dead Horse State Park, Sedona. Um, and that section for me was good. Again, I still just kind of was struggling to get my head in the game. Um, I think when I pulled into Sedona, I had passed a couple of people. through the night, going from Dead Horse or Deer Path into Sedona. Got into Sedona early Wednesday morning, like 6 a.m. Um, and that's like the most beautiful section on the course, leaving Sedona, climbing up Kasner Canyon, um, crossing Oak Creek, and getting up onto the plateau, the
Yeah.
Coconino Plateau, which you were with me as well for that.
Sedona is a
Greg
stunning
paced
area.
that
Yeah.
76 miles this year, was it? Something like that?
Yeah. It's in the neighborhood.
Yeah, mid 70s. Which trust I having done 80 miles the first year, that's hard. Pacing that much at a race is very difficult. It's harder than doing a race of that distance, I think.
Not as hard
A
as
race
running
of
250 miles.
no, no, not as hard as that, but it's harder than an 80-mile race. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, once like I kind of when I get up on the plateau at Cocodona, I feel like you're kind of I mean, you still have a ways to go, but that marks like the home stretch for me. It's like now it's a straight shot to Flagstaff, and then they make you do like a loop around Flagstaff, but that's another story. Um, so I definitely had a lot like day and night three is when I really start falling apart mentally. Like I don't sleep much in these events, so like the threads that hold you to reality and like keep your emotions grounded are very uh, thin at that point. So it was a struggle to like motivate myself to keep moving well during those plateau miles. I felt like I was slipping away and like that like not only was like the podium not in reach, but neither was like, like I was going to be happy with a top 10 finish at that point. It felt like I was slowing down and the people ahead of me were speeding up and there were people behind me. Um, so I remember pretty much riding those emotions all the way to Fort Tuttle. Um, and I know like Jeff Garmire was behind me pretty much from like Mingus all the way to Fort Tuttle. And I was using that as motivation, like, well, let's get to Fort Tuttle ahead of Jeff, and then we'll take it from there. So did that. Knew I needed to get some serious sleep at Fort Tuttle. Um, so I slept a significant amount of time there. Jeff came through and passed me, which I knew he would. But I knew if I got sleep at Fort Tuttle at this point, like I was going to be able to crush that last 35, 40 miles, and was hoping to catch as many people as I could during that last night stretch. Um, and it was a good night. We were able to pass five people and move from 10th to 5th. So finished strong. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was quite an adventure.
Yeah, so interesting to hear. So it sounds like, you said you weren't feeling anywhere near your best on night three, and who would, right, after running for 3 days, maybe four, depending on where you are in the field. But it sounds like you sort of were experiencing that despite feeling that way, everyone around you was moving similarly or maybe even a little bit worse.
Yeah, I think it's really like it's really hard to keep that perspective. Like when like again, it comes back to like when you're suffering, you tend to think that you're the only one suffering. Um, it's hard to extrapolate that onto like your friends, your competitors, your fellow racers. But like exactly, like obviously everyone was having a rough night. Like it's night three of a 250-mile race. Like very few
Right.
people are. I mean, there's anomalies, but most people are slowing down and really struggling at that point. Um, so it comes again like it comes down to the mental game. Like if I was able to harness what I did from Fort Tuttle to the finish a little earlier, who knows? Maybe I could have moved up a little bit more. But it's so much easier, sitting in front of a computer now to speculate about that than like
Right.
to harness that those emotions and those feelings and that drive when you're out there and just feeling so shitty and tired.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Well, sounds like you're ready to find out next year.
I mean, always improving, always learning. I think again, like despite like no one gets through unscathed, so like we all have our problems in these races, but I think I handled them the best this year than I ever have before, and I hope to improve on that again next year. I think that's the key.
Cool. Awesome. Any other closing thoughts in regards to Cocodona 250, your race this year, your race last year, in general, for everyone?
Um, no, I mean, I think just to go back to what I said earlier, like if you're thinking about doing one of these, like they are probably less scary than you've built them up to be in your head. Um, reach out to someone to chat about them. Like if you go to the Cocodona Facebook group and like ask questions, you'll get tons of good answers. You can reach out to me. Like you don't have to hire me as a coach if you just have a few questions about the race. Happy to, just chat casually about it, answer
Yeah,
questions. But I think it's going to be the premier 200 in this country for the foreseeable future. And I think if you're curious about it, you should just take the leap and do it. And the beauty is, if you're not ready for the full leap, you can sign up for the Sedona Canyons 125 or the Eldon Crest 40.
great ways to trial it out with a little bit less
Yeah,
commitment. Yeah,
yeah. Or
awesome.
volunteer, pay someone, work the race. There's so many ways to get involved. It's really fun.
Great. Well, Kevin, thanks again so much for coming on today and telling us about your decade of experience in the sport and particularly about the Cocodona 250. What's next for you?
I have Tour de France in September this year, which is uh, a looped 200 in the Italian Alps. Um, for a little perspective, Cocodona has about 30,000 feet of elevation gain, and Tour de France has about 90,000 feet. It's a real steep mountain race that is kind of considered like the Super Bowl of 200s. It's one of the older 200s, and it has like 1,200 people who enter, so it's a big race. I'm excited, very excited about it, but also more intimidated than I've been in a long time. So that's my goal for this fall, and we'll see how it goes.
And when is that so that we can tune in?
September 10th it starts,
September 10th. Awesome.
at
Any
10
projected
a.m.
finish
Italian
times?
time. I think I'm shooting for 80 to 85 hours, which historically would be top 10 and first American on most years. Um, but I think
Big
I'm shooting for
goals.
time over like, yeah, yeah. I mean, I hope to do well, but I'm definitely treating this a little bit more as an experience than a race, whereas
Yeah.
Cocodona was a race.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again, Kevin. Where can people find, follow, and support you?
I'm on Instagram. My Instagram name is ultraflykev. Ultra like ultra running, fly like fly fishing, Kev like the first three letters of my name. Um, or you can find me on Training Peaks in their coach directory. Search for Cocodona or 200
Awesome. We'll be
or
sure to
my name.
include the links in the description. So
Cool.
cool. Well, thanks again, Kevin. And we feel like we've really got a great plan for our own 200 plus mile training events. So, um, yeah, any other final concluding words before we jump off?
No, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Take care.
Bye.
All right. You don't have to. Okay, so that was our interview with Kevin Goldberg on the 2023 Cocodona 250-mile race, where he finished fourth among the men's field, fifth overall. We hope you came away from today's conversation with some interesting tidbits of information in regards to the Cocodona 250, as well as how to better train for events of the 200 plus mile length. Kevin is a coach as well as an athlete, so if you are interested in working with him, we will definitely include some links in the description below. He does specialize in helping athletes excel at the 200 plus mile length of race. At Treeline Endurance, we are always working to help endurance athletes go the distance and to help people find fulfillment and success in all of life. If you'd like to learn more about us, feel free to check out our website at treelineendurance.com. Thanks for listening.